Was that me? Am I good? All right, if you find your seats, we'll get started. Joanne's still talking, so we need to just give it a minute here. So. How's everyone doing? You guys sound all keyed up this morning. I was telling Joanne yesterday we had to take a quick trip down to Pueblo, pick up some things, and I told her there was something about the snowstorm, even though we didn't get snowed in, I just felt isolated and all that, and I'm like, I can't wait to get here and see somebody. So I'm so thankful that you guys showed up. We're going to be talking today about the unchanging God. We're wrapping this series up. I wanted to talk about this, though, particularly in the light of one particular part of his unchanging characteristic. So we'll talk about it in general. We're going to be looking at a couple of verses. But I want us to be thinking about this again because this whole series was about this idea that I think most of our problems come from one of two things in our relationship with God. It comes from either the fact that I really don't know him. And when I say I really don't know him, a lot of times we know a lot about him here, but not here. So I can answer questions, I can give you ideas about him, but do I live as though that's a reality? So it's either that, or the other thing is in the moment I do know him, but I forget. And then I respond in ways that are not that great. So as we wrap up this series this morning and kind of go next week into, we're still going to kind of be in it next week, but we're getting into the real close to Easter, so we want to kind of shift our focus to that. What does it mean that God's unchanging? Here's a quote, and this is one that you've heard before, probably many of you have anyhow, and then a couple of verses. No man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man. I am the Lord, I do not change. You are always the same. Let's pray. Father, this morning, it's just so good to be here, to share and worship and hearing your word. And so open our hearts to receive. And God, I just pray that this be a morning where we're gripped again by how amazing you are and how good you are and how big you are and how much you want to be part of our journey, how much we really can depend and trust our lives to you. So just in these moments, open our hearts to receive. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, if I was to ask this question without giving any kind of details, or are you the kind of the person, if you're the kind of person that if I say, let's change it up, are you kind of like this or like this? You like change? Think about this, and I from we're going to be looking particularly at Psalms 102. It's 28 verses long, so I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to tell you a little about how the chapter, how the truth weaves its way through this chapter. Story of a broken man that ends up at the end of the chapter saying this, and I'm going to tell you. And we want to think about how he got there. But the thing that strikes me is just this. Change is constant. And particularly if you're a person, because some of you, even as I say change, you're like, yeah, let's go. What can we change? And there's other views like, oh, dear God. What? Wherever you are on it, change is constant. Think about it. I want to think about this just quickly with you to set up our talk. Think about your relationships you have, how much they change. Like when you were in high school, you had your BFFs, and you thought when you're this age, you thought you were going to be friends forever, or college, and it's like, who are these people? You get the old book out, and it's like, I remember a few of them. I wish I didn't. Like, when was this? But relationships change. Marriages change. Parents change. Kids change. Relationships just change. And sometimes it's for the better, sometimes it's for the worse. I've listened to just gut-wrenching story because of my position. I have to listen to changes that some of you had to go through, and I'm like, what? You never saw it coming, and just change happens relationally in our lives. Change happens in technology, and man, for some of us, we fight back. Man, we just the idea that everything's changing so fast. And I read an article, and this was years ago. I can't imagine what the time lapse is now, but it was an article in the U.S. News and World Report years ago. This is probably the 90s, where they were talking about the production of computers, and there was a picture on the article that showed this. They were taking computers, and it was a giant loader was loading computers and melting them down. And the article said this. In the production of computers, in 9 months, if they're not sold at that time, in 9 months, they were obsolete in 9 months. And we're trying to keep up with that? That's why some of us fight back. I still have this old thing, and I try not to answer it because I'm somehow stuck in the past. But anyhow, that's for another topic. But life just changes, and then knowledge changes. What we know now compared to what, and you only have to go back 100 years and say, you guys believed what? You thought that's how it was? Knowing that someday they're going to look at our generation and say, what was wrong with you guys? And in this constant change, we have this way of looking at life for like, it's never going to be the same again. Remember when, for those of you who were alive when 9/11 happened, we're like, something happened there, and it's never going to be the same again. And then we kind of got used to the new normal and how airports worked and all of that kind of thing. And then COVID hit. And we're saying, it's never going to be the same again. I was talking to, I just finished a job for a guy that has a home out in Bear Basin area. He lives in Kansas City, and he eventually he's going to move here, him and his wife. We're going to retire here. And they come here for a week at a time and kind of watch the progress of their house being built, and then they have to go back. And I was talking to him about his job and his wife's job, and his wife's job's remote. She could stay here the whole time. His isn't. And I asked him, I said, how's that working out? Are they actually making you guys go back? And he said, oh yeah, in the case of my job, the companies are finally saying, you show up or we'll replace you. So there's kind of this maybe, but you know, life is just so full of change, and sometimes it just makes us weary. To try to keep up, to try to keep everything, to try to think through everything, to try to, and so now as we go to Psalms 102, there's a person in this psalm, and I'm not going to read. Let me just read a little bit of it so that you. The psalm starts. Man, if you want an interesting read this week, spend some time in this psalm. The psalm starts, and this guy is feels like he's life has swept over him, and stuff has happened to him, and there's all kinds of things going on. And he says, these are just I'm not reading just a couple of lines from the first verses, just so you get a feel of what's going on. Lord, hear my prayer. Listen to my plea. Don't turn away from me. Bend down and listen. My heart is sick. And if you read the first 11 verses, here's what it feels like is happening in this gentleman's life. Feels like he's a middle-aged person because of some references like, you're not going to strike me down. But we're not sure what triggered these feelings. But there's a lot of things happening in his heart. And it's described this way. If you look at the first 11 verses, he's in grief. He's lost his appetite. He's hopeless. He can't sleep at night. And he's got a chronic aloneness going on in his heart. And he's like, are you still there? Do you have any clue what's going on? And how are you going to respond to this? And as I read that, it feels to me like there's a couple of things that are going on inside of him. One, the things that he values, he can't hang on to. Like things keep changing. And so there's these things he values, there's these things he enjoys, there's these things that energize him, and there's these things he longs for and anticipate, but he can't hang on to them because life just moves on. And I tell you, for some of us, that reality is so interesting. When I was a kid, it felt like summers would never end, right? Like you'd get out of school and summers went on and on and on. And then finally summer was over. And then when I was a young adult, summers went by quickly. Would you start looking like this? You're like, there was summer? Like it happened? Like, it just feels like things move so fastly. So the one thing is, he can't hang on. It feels like he's struggling to hang on to the stuff that's close to his heart, to the stuff that brings him meaning. And then there's just the thing of, at the end of the day, change happens so quick that if I don't pull through, it feels like he's got some sort of sickness going on, because he talks about the ache in his bones and things. So it feels like that. But if somehow God doesn't rescue me from this sickness, no one will remember me. I'll just be gone. Change is constant. And life is moving along quickly. So how do we live in this world, live well in this world where that's a reality? The second thing that I get from this text is God is unchanging. Now, even as I say that, it's an odd thing to even try to think through. An unchanging God. For this reason. When I think of somebody that's unchanging, or a situation that's unchanging, or a business that's unchanging, or a culture that's unchanging, doesn't it feel like they're hopelessly stuck somewhere in irrelevance, and eventually they have no purpose and no meaning? When I think about that, my mind goes, I don't know why it goes here, but it goes to Napoleon Dynamite, for those who watch. Remember the guy, that weirdie that was kind of like stuck in the past hopelessly, and he couldn't somehow work his way out of that? Like it would be if somebody walked in here from the 70s and dressed like they did in the 70s and looked like, you said, what is wrong with you? It's not the 70s. So when I, even as I say God is unchanging, what does that actually look like? And how does that unchanging thing give us some sort of security? Well, let me just mention to you, just remind you of this. One of the things that's said about, if there's really truth in the whole idea that our generation is seeing change at a rapid pace, and I just want to just say this and kind of to set this up. One of the things, my grandpa was born in 1900. He died in 1998. We were rooting for him to hit 100. He didn't quite make it. I remember when he was in the late 80s, he told us, he had some of us grandkids around, and he told us about the time when they heard that there was a horseless carriage going to be going up the road near them. They walked, I don't know how far, sat beside the road, this family did, for hours, and then it went by, and they're like, What? What is that? Anyhow, and then he started talking to us about the stuff he's seen in his life. Imagine being born in 1900 and dying in 1998. And he looked at us and he said this, you guys will see way more change. Now, it's interesting when it talks about Abraham because it's easy to think about cultures in the past. Well, they didn't have that. But you know what it says about Abraham in Hebrews? He was just longing for a city that had a foundation and had no change. And somewhere in this culture that we're living in, where we're constantly being forced to kind of rethink our lives because of God comes into our hearts and says, I don't change. Never. Not even a little bit. Wow. Does that mean he's irrelevant? Like he was really good for the Abraham generations, and maybe even 100 years. But man, now in the speed of things, where is he at all this? And how do we somehow anchor our hearts and our lives into something that's? But isn't there something inside of you, even as I talk about change, that just longs for something that isn't? Because what we can do with this really quickly, for those of us who are a little bit older, and maybe even for some of you younger, you tend to go back to a place in time when life felt as perfect as it ever was, and you say, that was the good old days. And you want to freeze that moment in time. If I could somehow freeze it in time, then I could live with some kind of. And what the guy in the Psalms finds out is you can't. Now, here's what happens. Let me just go. When the chapter ends in verse 27, let me go back to him and then I'll talk about the unchanging God. When he ends up, he comes to this idea that you're always the same. So he goes from this place of despair where he's lost his appetite, he can't sleep, he has this aloneness, he's just feeling like, man, you talk about a description for just massive depression. This guy, I mean, he wrote the book on it apparently. To at the end of the chapter, he's come to a place of assurance and confidence and dangerously close to praise. What happened in one chapter? Because he didn't do the things that I would tell people to do or are kind of stuck. Did you ever think about switching your diet? Maybe you need to go to the gym and get out and exercise. Maybe you need to find some community and find some friends and engage. And dude, you're stuck in a hole. You need to figure it out. Isn't that kind of what we can kind of say? This guy, at the end of it, says his whole focus and it's shifted. What happened? Well, one thing that clearly happened is he quit looking here and he started looking up, and all of a sudden he's like, oh, you never change. And somehow that was a swinging point in his heart. So what about this God that never changes? Again, I think it's hard for us to think about this because we constantly change. You change your mind because of new information. So you're constantly we constantly do that. We get new information, so we change our mind. We change our character because of new influences. Now, they might be good, might be bad, but we're constantly changing as individuals. And he doesn't. How do I anchor my life into that? So that even as I live in this world that I want it to slow down and I want things to kind of be a little more secure, How do I anchor into him? Let me just go to the last point, and I want us to sit here for just a moment. Because this is only one piece of what an unchanging God, the influence on our hearts. But I want us to really buy into this one. And it's this. God makes an unchanging love commitment to you. See, in a world that changes, I need something more than just you're unchanging. As good as that is, I need to know that how it's going to affect me, and here's how it affects me directly, especially as we go into the Easter story, into the crucifixion story. He made an unchanging commitment to love you if you're his child. And that doesn't even make sense to us, because how would he even do that? And what is that? What are the implications of that in my life? Like, how does that even play out in my heart? Because as I go through my life, I go through it because I'm stuck in time. I go through it in time. And so there's moments in my life, I suppose in my own head, that it's really easy for God to love me. Do you ever think that? Like you're in a kind of a good place. Your fellowship with him it's sweet, it's rich, it's all of that. And so right now in this moment, and then I have that, and then I go through these other times. He still loves me? See, think about how he makes an unchanging love commitment to you, because he's sitting outside of time. So he sees the entirety of your life before you live a day. And when you surrender your life to him, he sees the entirety of that. Every good day, every bad day, every great decision, every poor decision, he sees it all. And he says, I'm giving my love to you, to all of this. And that's why he's never taken back when you see the point? Like he saw all of it and he said, I love you. And I think this guy in the Psalms all of a sudden realized he loves me so. He's never changing. And how that plays its way out in the Old Testament, in the love story of the Old Testament, he kept telling those people over and over again, I have everlasting love toward you. I have steadfast love toward you. I have unending love to you. I love you, I love you, I love. And even when in the book of Hosea, he said, you guys have prostituted yourself. You guys have left me. He still comes back and says, guess what? I still love you. And that is fantastic news in a world where everything is changing and relationships are changing and stuff is changing. That I can take it to the bank. I'm loved by him. Always. The implications of this. Think about the implications of this. I've heard this. I started hearing this idea years ago when I was working in the prison as a chaplain's assistant, and I was up on death row, and I would talk to the guys. Particularly, you heard it on death row, because when you work death row, these are not the good guys. Not a good guy on death row. These are the guys that have really kind of, and they all had a date. Somewhere there was a date where it was all going to end, which is different than us. We don't know that, but they did have their dates. And they'd say, you know what? After what I've done, if you had any idea, what they didn't know is I actually had access to their records. I did know what they'd done, at least in part, what was recorded. If you had any idea he can never forgive me. Never. And that was kind of my first little gig at ministry, if you want to call it that. And then I eventually ended up here and doing this. And you know what I hear from people in the Christian community? I don't think he could ever forgive me. Do you have any clue? But see, because he was out of time, if you're his follower and you surrendered, he was out of time. He wasn't bound by time. And when he said, I love you, and made a covenant love relationship with you, I promise you he loves you. See, you can be forgiven of your junk. I've heard people say this, yeah, he loves me and he forgives me, but now I don't have plan A anymore. I'm not part of that. I'm either on B, C, or D, or maybe he kind of cashed in my plan for it. No. See, the unchanging God, who is unending, unchanging love for you, doesn't quit because you've tanked it. That is just fantastic news, isn't it? Let me, there's other things I can talk about, but I want to, let me wrap this up with a story from Lisa Harper. Some of you might recognize that name. Lisa was living in I heard her tell this story, and I thought it applies, and I'm trying to remember some of the details. She was living in Nashville in her 20s, and she had this relationship with this guy, and it was a friendship. And so they would occasionally go out to eat. They'd meet occasionally and go out to dinner together, and they'd have and they never went because they were both in their 20s and neither of them had much money. They'd never really go to any place really nice. She said mostly it was either fast food places or then occasional Olive Garden and that kind of thing. And this went on for a year. In her mind, she's thinking, I wonder if this will ever go anywhere. Like, she kind of liked him, and apparently he kind of liked her because this thing kept happening. They were never officially dating or going out or whatever you call it in that time period. But they had this, and then he called her and said, hey, for Valentine's Day, I'm taking you to, and he named the restaurant. It was rated either as the top or one of the top steak joints in all of Nashville. Like, this is high-end stuff. And it's on Halloween. Valentine's, sorry. It's on Valentine's. Man. Yeah, wouldn't that? It was on Valentine's Day, and she's like, oh, man, maybe something's coming. So she's kind of keyed up, and she gets herself all dialed up, and she goes and shows up, and he's squirted too much cologne on him, which guys do. And anyhow, they go in there, and she describes it as we were in 8th grade again. Like, just all giddy and, sitting here eating steak. When it was done, when the meal was done, the guy motioned, and one of the servers brought this box over. And the name on the box was, if I remember correctly, James or something like that. And it was a high-end ladies' clothing store. And she's like, oh, he didn't buy me. In her mind, she's like, oh, he didn't buy me something from there. To give you some sort of reference, the dresses in that store started at $1,000 and went up. And so she's like, okay, so he doesn't, yeah. Anyhow, so she's thinking in her mind, probably what happened is he bought something, had his mom repackage it in this box. Yeah, we do that kind of thing, don't we? Or don't you? Just don't. Anyhow. She opens it, and when she opens it, there's a seal there, and she's like, "You're freaking kidding me. I got a dress from this store." And she pulls it out, and it just happens to be, I don't know if he meant to let the tag in there what he paid for it or not, but she saw that, and then she saw the size. I have my own size story, so mine's so much different than this. Let me just, because I went there. I went dress shopping with the kids for Joanne. Some of you have heard this, and I came home with a size 10. It happens to be at that time she was size 4. I didn't get any brownie points from buying that dress. This happened to be a size 4, and she was a size 8. And inside of her, she's like, "Oh, that's okay. I'll pretend to be really excited, and then tomorrow I'll just take and swap this thing out." And he says this to her. He says, "Hey, I really want you to try this on. I'd love to see you in this." And she's like, she tries to play it off, like, "No, you really don't. Nah, thanks. This is so cool and all this." He keeps pushing her, and then finally she's like, "Okay, I need to tell you. There's no way I can fit in here." He says this, and by the way, guys, if you're wanting your life to end quickly, this is what this guy said. She said, "Hey, I'm sorry, you didn't know my size." And he says, "Oh, I know exactly what size you are." And then he said this, "I feel there's a line between cute and beautiful. You are about 15 pounds from that line." Yeah, somebody needs to take this guy out and just... He went on to say, "If you ever fit in this dress, I'd be willing to have a relationship with you." You know why I tell you that story? That is exactly how some of us view God. We are so close to being an object of his love. So close, just 15 pounds. And then I'll be beautiful for him. Really? What if the unchanging God made an unchanging love commitment to your life this morning? And you might be in here and you need to shed some stuff. Man, by all means, shed it. But know this. Right now, you're not cute to him. You're beautiful. You are beautiful. That's my unchanging God. And he looks at you and he's thrilled and he's excited. And if you do decide to shed some junk out of your life, please do. Man, that relationship gets more beautiful. But know this, it doesn't increase his love toward you at all. But that's how we think. I'm so close. And he comes into our hearts and says, if you had any clue how beautiful you are to me, how much I long to be in relationship with you, how much I long to give you security and a foundation and all the stuff that you're longing for. So don't leave here and work harder. Leave here and take the truth from your head to your heart and say, you know what I'm going to do this week? I'm going to live as though I'm loved deeply by an unchanging God. Today, tomorrow, through the junk of my life, through all of it. I'm forever loved. Josh and Mel, if you want to come. And as we go through this season of celebrating, when we think about especially, he died on a cross to show you that. As we go through this season, just receive that love into your heart and live in it well.